Devil's advocate then, why do we have to bother with all this fractal stuff? Why can't we just carry on with our companies the way they are? We're making money, so...
If we're making money, that's the big assumption, isn't it?
And if your quality and delivery
and control are all particularly boo.
But actually, every company has problems with lateness. I defy anybody to say they've got anywhere near 100% delivery on time.
Yeah.
Quality's often good, I think, in the UK, but profit... well, you were saying you've researched lots of small local companies.
Yeah, we have.
Nearly all of them are making nothing.
Well, let's go back to why we did it, because I think that's important. So we definitely, had not a quality problem so much, but certainly a delivery problem.
Yeah.
I think we also we're going to have a price problem, and that is our prices were relatively high in the market, was becoming more competitive as it moved to Eastern Europe. So a lot of the business in the UK was heading towards countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia.
What was this, 15 years ago or so?
Yeah, go on. 15, 20 years ago,
when
that move in the aerospace industry started to happen, and we started losing business to for instance, Czechoslovakia was actually a place where we actually lost business to. And that was purely on P. So it doesn't matter if your Q was right or your D was right, because you weren't losing it on that. You were losing it on P for price.
Yeah.
And if you late on delivery, effectively, your customer couldn't get it from you.
And now India and China are undercutting us massively with cheaper wage rates.
And
they're getting their quality sorted, so it's a problem.
It is. So P is a major problem, certainly in our culture, because the cost of labour is so high. You could argue it was 10 times the cost of Chinese and Indian.
And it will never be driven down again in this country because of the minimum wage.
Correct.
Which is probably a great idea generally, but it does mean that you can't be competitive by having cheap wages.
Exactly. I mean, it just means you can't make a whole lot of stuff in the UK that you might want to make. I mean, it just excludes it because you can't, because the labour rates are so high.
But
on a global basis.
It's a labour rates combined with free trade.
GATT.
So if there was import duties, which would protect the high labour rates in this country, then you'd be okay. That's sort of survivable. There's a sweet spot to be found in that.
But what it means surely is that we can't compete on boring stuff because people who can do it cheaper. So we have to compete on knowledge. And then we're into the whole question of how do you manage a knowledge-based company, and that's where this flexibility and fractal thinking all has to come in.
I suppose I have a problem with that because it's reductionist in its nature, even that statement. Somehow you can magically separate the knowledge side from the actual doing side. So I'll just do the knowledge side, and I'll get somebody over there to do the doing side. And I'm thinking, right, so eventually they're going to learn the knowledge side, and eventually say, well, we don't need you now, so we'll do it ourselves. So, given Japan, for example, they might initially have copied UK motorcycles, but and the designs of UK motorcycles, but that's not true now, and they don't use any UK designs now. All the design is in Japan,
and their bikes are great.
So that's not quite true. That these statements you can somehow separate them all out.
But to start with, I mean, what you're saying is even worse than what I was saying, because I think to start with, someone like China comes along and they're cheaper than us, and they can make all the easy things cheaper than we can.
Yeah.
But you're right, eventually they're going to be able to make all the really difficult things as well.
That's right.
And then we're really stuffed.
Correct. And until we get our heads around that we need to change and we need to integrate all these things and produce goods which are globally competitively priced, not just the really, really complex ones, because you can't employ the whole UK labour force based on just doing really, really complicated stuff, because there's simply most people aren't capable of doing really, really complicated things.
I'm trying to figure out what the opportunities are there in the future.
Well, the opportunities are to do everything. I mean, to onshore everything. But we have to change our model of work.
Well, our model's got to be better than theirs if they've got cheaper labour.
Very much so. I mean, in China, you can run an existing centralised, hierarchical, functionalised model and get away with it. It's not a problem. And India is the same. But
because you can have the bureaucratic costs and still be cheaper than us.
It's cheap.
And so it was in the Victorian England as well.
Yeah.
It was very cheap. And also the products they tend to make are very standardised.
Yeah.
But in the West, we can't do that anymore because the labour is comparatively very, very expensive. I mean, factors of 10.
Yeah. What's also happened is the supply chain has now moved to the Far East.
Yeah.
So just bringing the sewing back is not a solution. You see what I mean? Because you've still got to get your buttons and your zips and everything else, and the denim.
You can't get forgings made in the UK anymore. There's only about 5 foundries left, and all those sorts of things are just disappearing.
Yeah, so that's naturally what does happen, by the way. Yeah. So you cleverly say, well, we'll move the production because you have to, because you can't compete. And then, of course, that movement in production then changes the supply chains because all the parts of whatever you're making, the jeans or the cars, then have to come from within that region, and they do.
Yeah.
And then before you know it, you've lost control of everything. But I still want to come back to the main driver for us was, one is that we couldn't pay the labour enough to get the right quality of labour we needed in terms of the value-added labour, and we couldn't give the investors enough of a return to cover their risk. So in other words, investors were taking our money, and we might have been the investors, but that's irrelevant. I'm only going to put my money in if, one, it's safe, and two, there's a return on it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I'm not going to put my money in.
So they want, let's say, 10%, and to make that much profit, you have to pay the workforce virtually nothing. And so
there's
no overlap. It's just not possible to do.
So actually, when you look at it, is there a necessity to do it? And I say, oh yeah, absolutely. There's a massive necessity to do this. And to change the model of work, we need to make that move. The quicker we make that move, the better. But of course, there's so much inertia in the system that people just don't want to move.
Well, if your company's making 8% profit at the moment, it's easy to think, well, that's better than most people, and it's not too bad. We'll leave it. The fact that you could double that profit or more by changing to a fractal way of working, people just think, yeah, but we're making 8%, so and I'm creaming off 100 grand a year from that. So what the hell?
Yeah, but if it only was that though, I mean, if companies really were making, let's leave the term EBITDA out of it, because there's a lot of costs in EBITDA in itself. If you actually look at proper profit. And they say, well, yeah, what is the net out of all of this? Yeah, what are we getting back as shareholders? How much? I mean, if you look at the dividend payments of the average company in the FTSE, what is it, 3%? So I get 3% for risking my capital. And how many go moving out of the FTSE and how many go bust? Well, lots. So are you telling me 3% is enough? And I say, no chance.
Is the dividend usually about half of the net profit? I've suddenly realised I don't know this at all. Because half of it gets reinvested back in and half of it's paid out.
Absolutely.
As a rough guide, dividends are always going to be less than net profit, unless they're, giving away.
Yeah, because
some of their
you're
reserves.
going to retain some of the earnings. So you're going to retain some of the earnings and then pay the remainder out as a dividend. And but in order to attract capital into your business, you have to have a dividend. There has to be a bit.
Well, if you're only getting 3% on your capital, why would you put it in something risky like a company?
Well, you wouldn't.
Well, so all these things, the numbers we're all used to, for the last 40 years have sort of been appropriate as interest rates and inflation have been dropping and dropping and dropping. And now we seem to have turned a corner and interest rates are rising and inflation's rising. And so suddenly 3%, well, you're well behind.
Well, you're so far behind because it's 10% inflation.
Yeah, and you can,
so you're minus 7%.
And I can get 4% on a bond, on a treasury bond.
Yeah, and that inflation's not going to push profit margins up for any particular reason, is it? If anything, it's going to make it worse because materials are more expensive and it's hard to get price increases from your customers. So
and the customers
make life harder.
Customers aren't richer.
No.
So it's a more competitive
substantially
market.
Poorer. So being robbed by inflation and interest rates.
So we're heading for trouble, and people do need to think about better ways, and becoming fractal could be the answer.